in the UK. So we'll make a start. Hopefully a few more people will join us in a few more minutes. We have quite a number of people registered, so hopefully a few more will join. Welcome to the latest in our Partners Innovation webinar series. And I'm excited to introduce the webinar for today. You can see the topic on the screen there. And in a few moments, I'll introduce our two presenters, our two speakers for today as well. My name is David Guarini-Gilmartin. I'm the academic manager at the British Council Viet Nam. So it would be great, as you're joining, it would be great if in the chat you could just, I'm here in Hanoi, it's a pretty grey day in Hanoi, and with a little bit of drizzle and some showers. So just in the chat, if you could just let us know, where are you from? Which province are you from? Or which city in Vietnam? Or if you're from a different country, if you're outside of Vietnam, let us know which country are you from. It'd be great to know for us and our speakers. Some housekeeping before we start. So you can feel free to leave your cameras on, but please keep your microphones on mute during the main session to avoid any interruptions as the presenters are speaking. And please, as we go through the webinar today, please share your questions and any comments you might have in the chat box. We have plenty of time. We can maybe address some of the questions as we go through section by section, or we have plenty of time hopefully at the end as well to pick up on your questions. And do note that this session is going to be recorded so that we can capture the ideas and share them on our YouTube channel. I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. So by attending this session, you're letting us know that you're happy and you consent for us to record your image in case you happen to put your camera on. So I hope those housekeeping are clear. Oops. So today's webinar is based on research that our two speakers, Phung Dao and Mai Nguyen from Manchester Metropolitan University have conducted. This was part of British Council funded ELT Research Awards, and you can find this on the Teaching English website. In a few moments, I'll put that in the chat for you as well. And Mai and Phung are going to explain a little bit more about their research as well. On the left-hand side there, you can see the running order, the schedule for our webinar today. You should have all have received that yesterday with the invitation for this webinar. So hopefully you can follow that and you can think about what we're doing as we go through the steps. And as you can see there, we have plenty of time at the end for questions that Phung and Mai are happy to take. So moving on, our speakers, we have two speakers, as I say. Phung Dao is a lecturer in applied linguistics and TESOL at Manchester Metropolitan University, where he teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in applied linguistics. And Mai Nguyen is a lecturer also in applied linguistics and TESOL at Manchester Metropolitan University, and you can read more about her interest there. And all of this information you can find in the research that I'll share with you in the chat in just a moment. So it's great to have Phung and Mai with us today. They're actually from in my hometown of Manchester in the UK. So interested to see what the weather is like in Manchester today from Phung and Mai. Maybe they can share that in just a moment. So just to let you know, as well as the research that they've done, that they're going to talk about today, the K-12 research, they are also at the moment in the process of doing some research for us. They're doing a landscape review of online English language teaching at public schools in Vietnam. That's happening over the next 6, 9, 12 months. So again, it's going to be interesting to find out and learn a bit more about that research in the goodness of time. And also Mai is working on a project as one of our 5 teacher activity groups that are taking place this year in Hue province with teachers from Hue Doet. So that they have a lot of experience not only in research from Manchester Metropolitan University, but also working on research here in Vietnam. As I say, we'll have plenty of time for questions, so please do add those in the chat as we go at any time, and I'll try to moderate those and facilitate those. Also, I'll let you know now, and we'll come back to this later. As I mentioned before, we have lots of resources for you on our Teaching English website here at the bottom. on our Facebook page and also on our YouTube channel. So I'll put links to all of these in the chat. And as I say, after this webinar, we'll put the recording of this webinar in with the in the playlist for our Partners in Innovation series. You can see all the previous webinars here. And I'll put that link in the chat in just a moment. And also, when we finish, before we finish, I'll also let you know about a webinar that is taking place on Wednesday from our colleagues, our British Council colleagues in Indonesia. This is about gamification in ELT, in English language teaching, and it's one of a series. So I'll tell you more about that later on. Okay, that's just a little taster for you. Okay, so back to our speakers. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mai and Phung, who are going to tell you about their research and about their content for today. Phung and Mai, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Zavati, for a very nice introduction. We'll just share our screen, the slides, and then we'll get started. First of all, we'd like to thank everybody for taking the time on a Saturday afternoon to join us. In the next hour or so, what we'd like to do is to share with us share with you some of the key findings from our recent research, which is funded by the British Council, on K-12 Vietnamese learners' oral peer feedback in classroom second language task-based interaction. We'd like to make the session quite an interactive one, so it's not just us presenting our findings and what we did with our studies, but also we would like to have your opinions and your feedback and for you to share your experience in teaching second language speaking in your own classroom as well. So please feel free to join in the activity that we will be organizing within this section. All right, so this is the structure of a section today. We'll have two main parts. The first part is mainly to understand oral peer feedback, and we have some activities for you to engage in order to activate your thinking and your experience with using using and promoting your learners' oral peer feedback as well. And then in the second part, we'll focus on describing our research, what we did and what we found in our study. And then the most of the time in part B, we will be sharing some of the pedagogical implications that hopefully you can take away to get some ideas for your second language speaking classroom. To get started, we'd just like to ask everybody just a very simple brainstorming question. What do you think is peer feedback in a second language speaking classroom? If you could share with us in the Teams chat some of your very quick thoughts on what peer feedback is. Let's see if we've got any responses yet. I'll just give everybody a couple of minutes to think. Think about your own speaking classroom when you organize pair or group work activities for your learners to complete an interactive speaking task. What kind of feedback do you imagine or have you seen your learners give to each other during those activities?
We got one definition here is comments and correction from classmates.
Wow, very good, very good summaries there. Yes.
Students give comments on other students' performance.
Excellent. So from those responses, I could see that everybody here attending this session, you are all very experienced English language teachers, and you often do interactive activities for your learners to interact within your speaking lesson. Phung, could we then present our own understanding of peer feedback then. Peer feedback is all the different kinds of information that the learners give to each other during a speaking activity in order to signal to their peer that there's some problem or some inaccuracy in their peers' use of language. And what's interesting about peer feedback, which is quite different from teachers' feedback to learners, is that peer feedback is given by peers who hold an equal learner status. So no peer is actually more knowledgeable than other. They're just trying to help each other within to complete a task well. And therefore, within peer feedback, learners are both active providers and also receivers of feedback. They play both roles. Let us give you a more specific example of what an instance of peer feedback might look like in a second language speaking classroom. So suppose that you give your learners a speaking task to do, and then you've told them the instructions, and now they go away to do the task by themselves within their small group or within a pair. Now, one learner, during their completion of a task, he or she says, one man traveled to the work and then he drive his house. The other learner, knowing that, okay, something's not quite right here, you can't really drive a house, and it's not very correct within this context of the task, then the other learner says, horse. And then student one now realizes something is not quite correct with the way that she is pronouncing this word, and the peer has corrected her. So now she says horse, and then learner 2 reconfirms that and says yes, horse. So this is an example of how an episode or an instance of peer feedback might take place within learners in a second language classroom. So now that we are quite on the same page about what peer feedback is and what peer feedback might look like in a second language speaking task, the next thing that we'd like to do is to just ask for your experience in terms of how your learners may be using peer feedback or maybe giving feedback to one another during a second language speaking task. What we'd like you to do now is if we could ask everyone to go on to menti.com. Right. So if we could ask everyone to go to menti.com now and enter the code that is shown on the shared screen here, 59434744. We will then start with the very first brainstorming question. So within the next few questions, we'd like you to think about your own learners and your own second language speaking classrooms, okay? The first question is, according to your observation, how often do your learners provide feedback to each other when they complete a pair or a group speaking task? So please reflect on your own second language speaking classroom, and how your learners may provide feedback to one another. Is that never, or sometimes, or often, or always? And so this is from your own observation. Right, we've got 10 responses already. You are all very fast and efficient, right? Let's wait for a few more seconds to see if we have more responses, but so far, based on your observation, it looks like your learners only sometimes provide feedback to each other when they do a speaking task in pairs or in groups. Right. It looks like sometimes is the dominant answer here. Okay. Let's see if we have any more responses. But it looks like yes. So this might have been the most common situation that you have observed in your speaking classroom, that your learners only sometimes give feedback to one another. Right. Okay. Now let's try the second question then. I'd like you to keep reflecting. Hang on. Oops. It's not moving forward. Let me just. All right, let me just try. Okay, now the second is a bit small now, but hopefully it's still okay on your screen. So I'd like you to keep reflecting on peer feedback in your own second language speaking class. So if you do observe peer feedback in your second language speaking class, what are some of the characteristics of this kind of feedback? I'd like you to read through the options and indicate whether you agree or disagree with these characteristics of peer feedback in your own classroom. Whether the feedback is focused on language features, like the use of vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. Whether the peer feedback is often accurate or not. Whether you think that this peer feedback leads to opportunities for learners to modify or to change their output so that their output is more accurate, or whether you think peer feedback often results in actual modified output, meaning learners actually correct their language use following feedback from their peer. Okay, we've got quite a few responses here already, and so yeah, so the numbers are changing now according to the more responses that we have, then the more we can see the experience, the observation with peer feedback in your own classroom. So we've got 12 responses now. Okay. So for example, in terms of whether or not the peer feedback is focused on language features, we've got the average is 2.6, which means, well, yes, maybe sometimes it's focused on language features, but sometimes it's focused on other things. If the peer feedback between your learners in your second language speaking classroom is accurate, 3.2, that is above average, isn't it? So we can say that looks like peer feedback that your learners give to each other is often quite accurate. Also, whether or not it leads to opportunities for learners to modify their output. 3.4 is quite a good one, which means that your learners do give their peers opportunities to modify the output after they've given the feedback. And the final characteristic, whether peer feedback results in modified output, in actual modified output, yeah, 3.1, which means that your learners are very likely to modify their own output following feedback from peers. So very good observation there in relation to peer feedback. All right. Okay. Okay, now the next question. We'd like you to think about the factors that might affect your learners' provision of peer feedback in a pair or group speaking task. So in the first questions, many of you said that your learners only sometimes give feedback to their peer in terms of their language use in a pair or group speaking test. So which factors do you think might influence how often your learners give feedback to each other? This is an open-ended question, so we've given you a space to write your response and to add to Mentimeter. And your responses are anonymous, so please feel free to let us know what you think, why your learners may or may not give feedback to one another. Great, we've got the first responses already. Lack of confidence. It depends on the relationship between students. This is a very good point. It depends on the student's personality and the class atmosphere. Right. This is a very good observation. Lack of language knowledge or lack of content knowledge or awareness of the tasks or criteria. Or they don't know which aspects to give feedback on. That's a fair point. Because learners are perhaps not quite experienced in unlike the teacher in how to respond to their peers' problems with language use. Time range for the activity, whether they are required or not, or with the atmosphere, the student's competence, student's background, or somebody else. Another response says student's personality. That could be an influencing factor as well. The familiarity of the topic, or this is a very good one, afraid of hurting relationship between themselves and their peers if, for example, they are too straightforward in the way that they correct the other learner, their peer. So again, these are all very, very good, very good observation that shows we have a very experienced, we have many experienced teachers in our audience today. Thank you so much, everybody, for sharing your experience and observation with peer feedback in your own classroom. Now, before we go on and explain some of the characteristics of peer feedback from a theoretical and a more research-based perspective, we'd like to ask your opinion on how useful you think peer feedback is for learners' second language learning in terms of, for example, helping them to use the language better, to speak better, to be more confident with their speaking. How useful do you think peer feedback is? Right. We seem to have quite a consensus here that many of you think peer feedback is either useful or very useful for second language learning. And this makes us feel very confident to continue discussing this topic with you within this section, because it looks like we are on the same page here regarding the usefulness of peer feedback for second language learning. So yes, so now I would like to hand over to Phung, and he will explain some of the theoretical backgrounds surrounding the usefulness of peer feedback in second language learning.
All right. Hello, everyone. Mike, can you see my computer screen now?
It's showing clearly, yeah.
Hello, everyone. It's very nice to see your reflection in the survey that I did. And actually, what you put there reflects what we found in our research. And I will be talking more about that. But it's very interesting to see that. And I'm very confident that you are not only experienced teacher, but you have potential to become a researcher. And hopefully in the next section, when I'm talking about research, that can give you some ideas about research if you are interested in developing that skill. All right. So in this session, I will talk a bit about feedback in terms of theories. We talk about practical stuff, but put it into the theoretical perspective. And I'm trying kind of to give it in a very, how can I say, in a lay language so that you can understand the terms, because there are different terminologies here. In theories, we said peer feedback is useful, like you said, very useful. In your last survey, you said peer feedback is useful for learning, but how can it be useful In theory, we say feedback is useful for learning because when learners give feedback to each other, it means that they are paying attention to the language issues. So attention is important. It means feedback triggers learners' attention to language issues. And when you are paying attention to language issue, there is a chance for you to modify the language. And you learn from friends in order to modify your language. You correct your language according to your friend's feedback. That helps you learn. So that's the first theory saying that yes, feedback does promote learners' attention to language issues. The second theory that explains the usefulness of feedback for learning is that when you are providing feedback, you are actually showing that you know the language issues and you are able to correct it. This means you are transforming your declarative knowledge. Declarative knowledge is the knowledge about the language. You know whether it is right or wrong. That is your declarative knowledge. And then you transform that into the procedural knowledge. Procedural knowledge is the knowledge of how. It means you know how to use it. So the practice of providing feedback and giving feedback to each other helps the learner to transform their knowledge of what? Declarative knowledge into the knowledge of how. It means how to use the language. So that's the second kind of theory backing up the usefulness of feedback for second language learning. And when the learners are providing feedback to each other, it means that they are providing each other assistance. As you know, language learning is a difficult task. And it is not only just the individual task, it can be a collaborative task. And that's why when the learners are providing feedback to each other, they are helping each other, they are collaborating with each other. This collaboration or this kind of assistance is crucial, first, for completing the task, and secondly, for learning the language. So in theories, we see that peer feedback is important in terms of helping the learners to learn the language. And feedback also one of the central aspects of learners' center teaching approach, because this is where the learner are doing the task of providing the feedback rather than the teacher. We normally think teacher is the one who are providing the feedback rather than learners. But from this, you see that learners are able to provide the feedback to each other. However, there's some issues with feedback, and you already mentioned earlier that some feedback is not accurate. Learners sometimes feel reluctant to provide feedback, or they're scared of hurting each other when they're providing feedback. So those are the issues. But when it comes to the research, I will show you some of the recommendations for addressing those issues. All right, but in this section, we will go further into feedback by kind of categorizing it into different categories. And what I'd like you to do right now, so I got the Google Doc here. I'd like you to visit the Google Doc. Let me share this link, the link with you in the chat box.
Mine's already shared it, Phung, in the chat.
Oh, I already did. All right.
Yeah. Right. There's actually a question, Phung. There's a question here. Some Nguyen or Nguyen, I'm not sure who that is, has asked, how can teachers encourage learners to give peer feedback? Are you going to address that later on, that question, towards the end of your session?
You repeat the questions, David.
Yeah.
I want to be interactive. I'm gonna answer the question.
Sure, no problem. Nguyen has asked, how can teachers encourage learners to give peer feedback?
All right. This is something I will be talking about, I think, later on in terms of how to promote peer feedback in the classroom. But one of the way we got is to train the learners. That is one of the way. And Mai will be presenting how to train the learners in order to provide the feedback. It's very quick for that, but Mai will be giving details about that.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah. So don't worry, Nguyen or Nguyen. Mai will be talking about that later on, addressing your question later on. It's good. It's a
But
great
your
question.
is very good.
It's
That
a
you
great
are
question.
aware
Yeah.
of this
Definitely.
feedback in the classroom. All right. And now for this activity, what I'd like you to do is to match the following examples with the feedback here. We got different kinds of feedback. If you see the column on the right here, we got morphosynthetic static recast. Basically, this is grammar, feedback on grammar. All right.
Sorry, could you share your Google Doc screen as well, please? It may be easier.
All right, I will be doing it. Sure.
Yeah.
Can you see it now?
I think it's coming up. Yes.
All right. So I'm coming back. So as you can see, I will repeat what I said earlier so that you can follow. And feel free to put questions in the chat bar if you have any questions. I'm very happy for you to interrupt me and then make it more interactive so that we can understand what we are doing here. All right. So if you see the types of correct peer feedback in the column on the right there, you will see we have different types of feedback. The first one is a morphosyntactic recast. Basically, that is a feedback on grammar. Lexical recast is a feedback on vocabulary. And clarification request is a kind of feedback where it can be focusing on all sorts of aspects, but it is more about clarify what you did not understand in your friend's previous utterances. And the next one, explicit correction, is mean that when you see that your friends has an error in his or her utterance and you explain the error, what it is, and you pointed it out. That's what we meant by explicit correction. And the last one is pronunciation recast. This is a feedback. That is on the pronunciation issues. So the definition there, so what I like you right now is to match with the example on the left here. And I like you to put the answers in the chat box in Teams there. So for example, the grammar recast, which example is it? We got from 1 to 5 here, and I'm not moving the screen now, but you can have a look at Google Doc and put the answers in the chat box. I'm going to give you some time to read through all of the examples and definitions there and to do the matching.
A little afternoon exercise for everyone.
We need some music while people are working. Phung and Mai.
Yeah,
I wish that I could sing.
Hang on, let me look for some music.
Just some easy listening while people are reading and processing.
Sure. We got one answer there, 1E. All right, 1E. We got pronunciation recast. Very excellent. I think that's the correct one. Good. We got another one too from OK, 1E. Excellent. How about number 2? 1E, 2D, 3C, 4B, and A5. So let's go with 2D. Okay. 3C, 4B. Any other responses? Or do you agree with your peer here? Okay, 1E, 2A, 3C, 4B, 5D. Good. Okay. 1E, 2A, 3B, 4D, 5C. Wow, we have different answers here. I'm going to give you some more time and then I will move into the answers.
I found some music. Can you hear it?
All right. Now, what I will be sharing with you in the next slides is the. It's all right that if you don't have the answer, the correct answers, because one of the things when it comes to feedback, what I just asked you to do is coding feedback in the data, and actually you are doing a research task here. And sometimes for research tasks, it's difficult for coding feedback. Sometimes there are some confusions there. So always we ask the second coder in order to code, in order to kind of compare answers with each other. And sometimes some feedback have like belongs to more than one category. So if you have different answers, that's not an issue. So in the next slide, this is what I'm showing you, the answers here. And I think some of you did a very good job in this. So definitely for number one, it is E, because the focus is on the pronunciation house and horse. Okay. Recasting is mean the reformulation of the previous utterances by providing the model. So house is in correct, but horse is the correct one. So that's the model. All right. And for the number two here, go and then went, that's it, the recast. And the focus is on the grammar aspect rather than pronunciation as in example number one. And number three here, this is a lexical recast because the focus is on the vocabulary, which is kill and sacrifice. Okay. And the next is the explicit correction. If you see the highlighted there, when a student provides explicit correction, it means that he or she is going to explain the answers, the corrections too. So you see a lot of meta-linguistic comments over there. I think it's a person who just eats vegetable is the wrong word. So when they say the word vegetarian, no, they say vet, it's not vegetarian. You give the explanation, that's why we say explicit correction. And the last one, clarification request, is where the students ask for further information. And here we got students say, given, what is given? Sorry, mistake, is a gift, okay, it's a present. So I hope right now you got some ideas about types of feedback. The reason why I'm asking you to categorize the feedback is that when you are observing the learners, we are paying attention to whether the learner provides the feedback or not. We also need to pay attention to the kind of feedback that they are providing and see what feedback is frequent, what type of feedback is frequent, what kind of feedback is rare. That is where you're gonna go in terms of intervention. Okay, so very excellent, everybody. I think that you got some skill for research, especially in terms of coding data. Now, another thing when it comes to feedback is that we are not only paying attention to the frequency of the feedback, but we are also paying attention to the modified output. What do I mean by modified output? It means that whether the learners modify their utterances after receiving feedback from their peers. Especially for teachers, sometimes when you are trying to correct the learners, you provide them feedback. Normally, some students respond to your correction, but for peers, it may not be the case. Okay, so we need to look further into feedback to see what is happening after their friends provide feedback. Do they modify the output? It means do they change their language following the feedback from their peers? And if they do so, whether their changes or their modified outputs is accurate or not, or whether they just ignore it. All right, so that is the next thing that you need to pay attention when it comes to peer feedback, because if we just pay attention to the feedback only, we don't know whether the student will learn or not. So when the student modify the output, it means first, they pay attention to their friends' feedback. Second, they learn from it. And that's why they modify. If they do not modify the output, we don't know whether they pay attention to their peers' feedback or not, or whether they understand the feedback or not, and whether they learn anything from feedback or not. So this is the next step that you need to pay attention to, especially when it comes to feedback. Okay, so just to give an example about modified outputs, how about going back to the Google Doc, then just look at the first example, and can you tell me whether the learners modify the output after receiving the feedback from their peer? And if the student does modify their output or their language, is that correct? And also whether their peers provide them an opportunity to modify the output after they give their peers feedback. Okay, so look at example number 1 here. I'm going to go back to example number 1 here. So for example, you see example number 1 here, and I'd like you to tell me whether the students modify the output after receiving the feedback from their peer. I'd like you to put the answers in the chat here with yes or no. Yes. Yes, David.
No, I was going to say we'll wait for a few answers in the chat. I can see a few people putting them in now.
Right.
But I've got when we get the answers, I've got a question for you about this.
Sure. We got 4 answers. Yes, yes, yes. I think they modify immediately, but later then they forget to modify.
So my question, so you've got some answers there. So my question is this. So for example, with number 1, like the speaker 1 says yes, horse. So they recognize, going back to what you're saying before about their knowledge, their sort of declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. So they say yes, horse, as in they know that's the right word. Is that an example of them modifying their output, or is that just them recognizing the word?
All right, thank you, David, for that question. I think I'm going to explain the whole excerpt here in order to clarify. So you see student number 1, he said he drive his house. So the error is house. Student number 2 is the feedback provider. So when I say horse, his attention was to correct student number 1, utterance is house. It means student number 2 does have declarative knowledge about the language. It means horse, not house. And he is able to produce that word, horse. It means he does have the procedural knowledge, the knowledge of how to use it. So this is the feedback. Student number 2 provide a feedback. Now we'll look at line number 3 to see how student number 1 respond to their peers' feedback. And you see when student number 1 say yes, it means that he acknowledged the feedback from student number 2. So it means he is paying attention. And then he said horse after that. It means that he modified his previous utterance. He tried the house too. He tried horse, but he just modified one word only, horse. That's the modif.
Okay, that's my question. My question is, even though it's only one word, that is enough for it to be modified output. It's not the whole utterance that has to be modified. Okay, thank you.
The key, thank you, Derek, for that to point out. The key is on the error. So as long as the student modify the utterances, especially that is related to the error that they made and the error that their friend provided feedback on, then that's the key. And you see here that student number 2 does say horse, and he stopped there. It means that he is giving student number 1 the opportunity to modify the output. But if the student number 2 say yes, and he stopped there, it means that he acknowledged the feedback. He paid attention to the feedback, but he did not modify his output if the word host in student number 2 is not there. All right. And if you look at student number 2 like host, when he raises intonation, this is the accurate feedback. So we call that accurate feedback. So in this case, we say the feedback is on pronunciation. The student does provide a feedback. The feedback is accurate. The student does provide his peer the opportunity to modify the output, and his peer does modify his output, and his modified output is accurate. So that's how we look at the modified output. All right. So I hope that you got some idea about that. But one good thing is that in the reality, it's very difficult to pay attention to everything like that. So the good point is, as long as they provide the feedback, as long as they say something, this is a chance for them to learn. All right.
Thanks, Phung. And there's a couple, just to let you know, there's a couple of comments in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see them or not. One from Nguyen, who says,
yes.
I think they modify immediately, but later they often forget to modify. So, and then Ming Tu as well says, okay, oh, that's acknowledging the error. So I think that's just understanding of your thing. But yeah, I think Nguyen's point is an interesting one about that. At that point in time, they might modify, but maybe later on they forget to modify.
Thank you, Nguyen. I completely agree with you for that. Students sometimes forget the opportunity, forget what they learned. We are treating this as a learning opportunity. We are not saying this is learning. We say learning opportunity is mean that students have an opportunity to learn. So when feedback occurs, there is a learning opportunity. And whether the learning opportunity becomes learning or not is another matter. And I completely agree with you. Sometimes students forget, sometimes students remember. So we treat this as a learning opportunity, not the evidence of learning. However, in other research, we try to link between the occurrence of feedback and learning, and we see the link here. We see the evidence. The more feedback the student receive, the more likely they learn. We say the more likely they learn, and the more likely they remember rather than nothing. So this is a good evidence for the link. But in this research I'm doing, we are not establishing that link. We just go with what is happening in the classroom. All right. So thank you very much for all of the questions. So please just jump in and put a feedback. I really like it, and it makes me to kind of clarify what I'm saying and easier. All right. So so just to give you like I already talked about this, so I'm gonna put the slide later on here for you. Now this is from the report, so you will see this table and you will see how we code the data. So actually what I just walk you through is how we code the data. All right. So now by this point, I hope that you understand what peer feedback is. Why do we pay attention to peer feedback? When it comes to research, how do we categorize peer feedback and how we code peer feedback? So in this part, I'm going to share with you our research about peer feedback. So our research basically focused on what is happening in the classroom. To what extent the student provide feedback? Is that feedback correct? All right. So if you look at the research inquiry here, we focus on three aspects. First, to what extent peer feedback occurs in the classroom? How do they look like in terms of characteristics or nature? And what are factors affecting feedback provisioning? In the survey I did with you, you listed a lot of factors and very interesting. Many of them appear in the findings. So for this research, basically, we try to see whether young learners, especially children from grade 6 to grade 9, whether they are able to provide learners with feedback or not. Normally, we think about a feedback. Is this the job of a teacher or is it for adult learners? But we don't know whether young learners who are still very young, who are just starting learning the language, who are not advanced learner, are they able to provide feedback or not? So we don't know that. That's why we don't have understanding about peer feedback provided by young learners. And this study focused on secondary school learners in Vietnam, in the south of Vietnam, and there were 68 of them coming from a secondary school in the south of Vietnam, and that's it, our target participant there. So how do we research their feedback? Basically, we didn't do any intervention. We just keep the class intact. We go there, ask the teacher to video, audio recording their interaction. And then later on, we deliver a questionnaire and then sit down with some learners in order to, in an interview, in order to ask about their perceptions of feedback. So that is how that's the method that we adopted in conducting this research. And for the coding, we just did the coding. We identify the types of feedback that occurs in the classroom. We explore the focus of the feedback. Is it on grammar? Is it on vocabulary? Is it on pronunciation? Or is it on what? And then we look at the quality of feedback in terms of accuracy. Is this accurate or is it not? And then we look at modify output. Is there an opportunity for them to modify the output, and whether the modified output is accurate or not? So that's the coding. Now, how about the results? And what do we learn from this? From the result, we audio recorded 297 interactions. So this is the interaction among learners when they are doing the activities in the classroom. The activities are varied. We didn't control any activities. The teachers did what they normally do in the classroom. So we recorded their interaction, and we identified 258 instances of feedback. This seems to be a very promising number. And we look at that total number, we see that 83% of them, more than 83% of them was recast. It means the student more reformulation of their friends' previous utterances. Only around 8% of them asked for clarification, and around 7% of the feedback was explicit correction. So you see, recast was the dominant types of feedback in the classroom. Okay, that's about the frequency. And even though I said earlier 250 seems to be a good number, but then we look at the mean in each interaction, and we realize it's on average there is less than 1 instances of oral peer feedback per interaction, and each interaction lasts about 15 minutes. So it goes back to the question earlier that you said, yes, they pay attention to the feedback, they do provide feedback, but it's very rare. And you see that on average, approximately about 1 instances of peer feedback occurs. So what do we see from this? At the beginning, Mai and I are trying to show you how feedback is useful for learning. How can it help the learners in terms of paying attention to the language, modifying the language? Now you see only few instances of peer feedback happens in the classroom. So we see it's useful, however, it's rare. So our job as a teacher, the pedagogical implication here is that as a teacher, we need to do something in order to increase learners' peer feedback. Otherwise, it is rare. We know that it is useful, but it is rare. So in order to increase the effectiveness of learning, this is a job of teacher to enhance it. How to enhance it? We will provide some suggestion for you later on. All right. In terms of characteristics, you see, a majority of them focus on grammar issues. And we realized it in the interview. They said that we would learn a lot about grammar in our program. That's why we focus on grammar. So this is interesting. So if your teaching was oriented towards teaching grammar points, students tend to focus on grammar issues. So if you want to increase their feedback on other aspects, it is important for the teacher to raise their awareness about language aspects. Grammar is important, but other aspects are also important too. So when you draw attention to different aspects of the language, this is a chance for them to provide feedback on other aspects rather than grammar. Now, the next thing that we found in our research is that we tend to think peer feedback is not accurate. And our research shows that 88% of the feedback is accurate. So this is very promising. It means that they have young learners, very young learners, beginners, they are able to provide the feedback, and the feedback is accurate. So it is important to encourage this. However, you keep in mind that feedback is also inaccurate, and you see that 11% of them providing the feedback on the errors on the language aspects which have no issues. So with this figure, we can see that should we encourage feedback or not? My interpretation is that yes, because you see 88%, so it's worth it. For teacher feedback, normally teacher feedback, I assuming is 100% correct. But for feedback, because the percentage is higher, then it's goes with that. How can we address the issue of the feedback which is not accurate? We treat this as the issue, but I treat it as the benefits. When the student provided feedback, even the feedback is inaccurate, it shows that the students are paying attention to each other. They are learning the language. So probably they are not developing accuracy, but they are developing all the language production. So I'm treating the inaccurate feedback here still as a learning opportunity for other aspects. It may not be good for accuracy, but it does show that students are paying attention. They think about the language. And as long as you think about the language, you learn. All right. And however, we need to train them in order to provide accurate feedback. So that's it. It comes back to the training there. Now, the next finding that I found in this research is that 2/3 of the time, it means about around 77% of the students did provide their peers with an opportunity to modify the output. So this is a good thing. They just not kind of provided feedback and they moved on. They gave their peers time to modify the feedback. And you see here, when it comes to the accuracy of the modified output, yeah, some of them could understand the feedback, and some of them could understand the feedback and could modify the output accurately, but only 40% of them. Most of the time, they forget or they did not modify, they just acknowledge and they move on. We realized that this is not an issue because when it comes to communication, learners' priority is to complete the task. So if the feedback on the issue that is minor, students tend to ignore it and then move on in order to complete the task. So with this, we see that it's just not an issue. It's just what's happening. And if we are able to draw learner attention to this aspect, we hope that they can increase their accuracy. And if they do not pay attention to it, that won't be an issue because the priority of interaction is on meaning, not is on correcting each other. So we need to keep in mind, and that's why sometimes we can downplay this aspect a bit, but it's just important. All right, so that's what we learned from research. And the last thing, the last finding that we found in our research is related to the affecting factors that you mentioned earlier. And I think that some of you, if you look at the list here, many of them match what you put in the answer in the Mentimeter surveys there. Students always said that proficiency is an issue when it comes to providing the feedback because they don't know how to provide the feedback. And what we learned is that proficiency is not an issue. Some students thought that their friends are very good learners and they are advanced. That's why they can help me. In reality, that student wasn't advanced. It's just because how the student perceive each other proficiency, you think that he's advanced. That's why he could provide a feedback. So actually, the actual measured proficiency is not an issue. How you perceive the proficiency of the other is important. So as a teacher, if students trust each other, they build a good relationship, then proficiency is not an issue. And if both of them are low at the they are low proficiency learners, they can work together in order to resolve the issue collaboratively. And that's also the strength when it comes to feedback. You don't have to be advanced learner in order to resolve everything. Another, yes, David?
I was just going to say, I'm really glad you raised that point, Phung, about the students, even if they have low levels or low proficiency, that idea of them exploring together and kind of maybe not giving accurate, of, you said it's great to see 88% accuracy, but even with the 11%, if they're exploring together, that is a great learning strategy. So it's very encouraging to hear that. There's a question for Phung in the chat from Phung asking, how many classes did you record per school?
For this particular study, I got it from 2 classes, because it's a longitudinal study where you record them over time. So I just have access. I had access to 2 classes, but they're from 8 secondary school. And for this particular report, it's a huge data. So we just abstract the data from 2 classes in order to produce those findings.
Thanks, Phung.
Okay.
I hope that answers Phung's question. Yeah, thanks. Back to you,
now,
Phung.
Moving to the other factors, as you can see here, lots of students saying that they don't want to provide a feedback because they want to avoid a confrontation. They want to be good friends to each other. So they don't want to say, I'm correcting you at on time. I don't want to assert my partner, and I want to save my peer's face. If I'm correcting him too much, he will be embarrassed. So those are social factors that you need to consider. And what we learned from this is that we ask the learners about how to address those, and what they comes up with is that as long as I'm working with my good friend, I don't have any issues with this. I can correct him whenever I want to, and I feel very happy when I am able to identify his error and I am able to correct his error. I'm having fun by providing feedback. So you see here, those issues can be addressed when learners are building trust with each other. They have good relationships. So it comes down to how you, as a teacher, create the facilitative, friendly learning environment. Those issues can be reduced. So that's something you can address in terms of the interpersonal and social factors that can occur when it comes to providing peer feedback. The next thing that the teacher can do is that some students saying that if the task is focused on the meaning, it's been communication, I rarely correct feedback, because what's the point of paying attention to the language aspects when the communication is on the meaning? So it is important for the teacher to think about that. The task that you are going to use, the activities that you are implementing should be on meaning focused. However, it should create the opportunities for the learners to pay attention to the target language. I gave you one example. So if you want to teach, let's say, simple past tense verbs, you create activity where the student interviewing each other about activities that they did in the past or last week. With that activity, when the student asking each other about what they did last week, they are somehow framed to use simple past tense verbs. So you don't need to teach it. They are kind of in the position to use those. And when they are using those, that is where they have issues with that simple past tense verbs. And when they have issues, they are providing feedback to each other. This is how we teach kind of like grammar features that you want to teach in a communicative way by paying attention to the meaning, but through communication, learners draw their attention to the target feature that you want to teach. So that is one pedagogical implication that we have here in relation to the task features. And one thing, when it comes to teaching young learners, they want to have fun. They want something new. So that is very specific to young learners. When it comes to the task, it has to be fun. It has to be new. And this is different from adult learners where the activities can be meaningful and that is enough. It doesn't have to be fun. It doesn't have to be new. But for young learners, those are the keys. All right. And the last thing that we learned is that when it comes to interaction, learners do have certain mindsets. They if their priorities is on the task completion, they will not pay attention to language features. If the mindset is that the errors are minor, I'm not going to correct them. If the learner said, whatever errors happen, my job is to correct it because the teacher asked me to do so, then it depends on how the learner set their mind when it comes to interaction. Some learners said, I have to correct him because he repeatedly made that error. So repeated errors is an issue here. Some of them saying that they need to maintain the flow of the conversation. So whatever feedbacks occurs, I don't care as long as I understand my friend. That's enough, and that's good. Another learner saying that I pay attention to language aspects a lot because my teachers ask us to do that. So it's up to you to kind of raise learners' awareness about what mindset that they have, and that will determine how they interact with each other, and that's also determine how they provide feedback to each other. So I hope that this research does give you some understanding of what is happening when it comes to peer feedback in young learners' classes. And the next part, as I promised, I will give it to Mai in order to share with you some of the ways for us. We are not saying intervention, but we think more about some of pedagogical ways that teacher can do in order to increase peer feedback in the classroom. As we know that it's useful, but the frequency is very low. How can we increase it? Mai will share with you some of the strategies. Mai, over to you.
In this final part, thanks Phung for explaining the research findings. So you've seen that from our study, peer feedback did occur, but the frequency is quite low, and also there are several factors that might influence whether or not learners want to provide feedback to each other. So in this part, we would like to share with you some of the strategies to promote peer feedback in a second language speaking classroom, and I think hopefully that would answer one of the questions that we had earlier as well. So Sato and Lister in their experimental study, they followed this procedure, this 3-stage procedure called modeling, practice, and use in context to train their learners, second language learners, to provide more peer feedback to each other when they are completing a speaking task. So the first stage, modeling, happens. This is, as Phung said earlier, much intervention is in second language acquisition research happens over quite a long time. So this is over the course of a 13-week speaking course. The first stage happens in the first 3 weeks. Is when the teachers repeatedly model to their learners how to give feedback to one another. So there are 2 teachers in the classroom, and they demonstrated a mini role play, and they decided beforehand which kind of corrective feedback they would like the learners to use, to train, to learn as well. In this case, they use recasts and prompts. We haven't mentioned prompts within our study because prompts did not really there's only a very limited number of prompts peer feedback in our research. But prompts are basically when learners do not provide each other with the correct information immediately, but they ask questions to prompt their learners, to prompt their friends' response. So in the modeling stage, these researchers demonstrated how to give peer feedback to their learners. In the next few weeks, from weeks 2 to week 10, what they did was put learners in groups to actually practice providing peer feedback to one another. And in order for the learners to practice providing peer feedback, what they did was they gave the learners role play scenario, and these scenarios are purposefully designed to ask learners to give peer feedback. If you could see on the screen here, for example, they have an example. There's an example of a sample scenario, and an error list as well. So the learners were also given, when they were doing the role play, they were also given a list of errors that they would need to purposefully make, so that the learners are given opportunity, the other learners are given opportunities to give feedback. So the learners were divided into groups of 3 each, and each of them was assigned a role. One is the speaker, the one is a feedback provider, and one is an observer. The speaker would act out the role play, and the feedback provider would detect the errors and give feedback. And keep in mind that the feedback provider, the feedback provider's role is focused on giving feedback, and the observer checks which errors are detected and missed, and then gives a report at the end of the role play. The learners then take turns to play all the 3 roles with different scenarios given to them each time. And finally, the final stage includes using the feedback training, the feedback strategy that they have been taught in context. In this case, you can see that the scenario or the role play in the practice stage is quite decontextualized. But in the using context stage, learners are encouraged to provide peer feedback to one another in a more authentic and communicative context. So together, the aim is to help the learners over a period of time, and we emphasize this is quite a longitudinal effort, to train learners to have the confidence and competence to provide peer feedback to one another. Right. So this is perhaps one of the most well-designed procedures for training for as teachers, how we could train our learners for to provide peer feedback to one another. I'm not quite sure if we have enough time, but if you could, I was going to do a Menti poll, but I don't think that's quite feasible now. So if you could just write in the chat on Teams what you felt about how you feel about the peer feedback training procedure that we've just explained to you. Do you think that it is feasible? Do you think you might use this procedure in your own speaking classroom? And if you do use, then what kind of adaptation you might want to make that procedure more suitable for your own learners and your context. So please let us know in the chat. Right now, the second thing that we could also do in order to help our learners provide more peer feedback to one another is to understand them and to really get information about how your learner think about receiving and providing peer feedback. And one way to do it is, as we thought, a quick and easy way is to use surveys with your learners. So in our research, we gave the participants, our learners, an open-ended survey, and we asked them what they think about so we asked them whether or not they notice their classmates' mistakes or errors when they complete a task together, and what do they do when they notice errors? Do they feel like do they feel comfortable giving or correcting each other's errors during a task, and also how whether they prefer immediate feedback from their peers or delayed feedback from their peers. So what if they do if they do feel comfortable with feedback, what kind of peer feedback were they likely to prefer when they do a task? So understanding our learners, we think, is also a very important way to promote peer feedback within second language classroom. Or you could also use a Likert skill survey if you feel that it's quicker and easier for your learners and for yourself. But either way, you will be able to get lots of very interesting and useful information from your learners in order to promote more peer feedback. Right, so the 2 strategies that we suggested, one is training learners to learn how to provide peer feedback. The other is understanding our learners' preferences towards peer feedback. So suppose that you've probably done both of these things, right? So you did some peer feedback training with your learners, and you also did some surveys with your learners in order to promote their peer feedback. But you still find that your learners still don't use much peer feedback in the classroom. And as a teacher, we know it's very good to learn from peers. Peer feedback is useful for learning and for their own for building their own confidence as well. And you really want to promote that in your classroom, but you still don't think that the strategies are working for you. What should you do? So what we suggest next is, as teachers, we are more than capable of being in control of all the pedagogical and also theoretical knowledge about teaching. So what we suggest is to develop your personal theory of peer feedback. What do we mean by personal theory? Personal theory is basically teachers' implicit personal understanding of any teaching and learning event. And this theory is very much based on our own experiences in teaching and also in learning a second language as well. It's quite different from expert theory, where you listen to what experts say. But in this case, we want to emphasize on us teachers, based on our understanding of teaching and learning from our own theory, and in this case, our own theory of peer feedback. And how do we form our personal theory of peer feedback? We can rely on our own knowledge of different teaching and learning events and experiences. In research, we have this term, teachers' personal practical knowledge. So as teachers, we could rely on different sources of personal practical knowledge. For example, our knowledge of ourselves as a teacher. This will help us to know which pedagogical strategies to use in our classroom as well. When it comes to knowledge of ourselves, you may want to ask yourself, for example, what role do I adopt during interaction with my learners in the classroom? Because if you want, Phung mentioned earlier about creating a very friendly and comfortable atmosphere so that learners feel comfortable to give feedback to one another. Well, in order for our learners to feel that, we as a teacher would have to model, to demonstrate that first, right? So if you find yourself in the classroom, you find yourself more of, for example, a facilitator or a co-learner, someone who learns alongside your learner, someone who's very encouraging and help your learners express their ideas, then it's very likely that it may influence how your learners may want to interact with their peers as well. The second thing is, you may also rely on your knowledge of peer feedback in order to form your personal theory of peer feedback. And we've discussed here about the usefulness of peer feedback for learners learning in general and different strategies to promote peer feedback. But it has to be you yourself who really see the relevance of these theories and these strategies. The third type of knowledge that you could rely on, the teachers could rely on in order to develop personal theory of peer feedback, is also knowledge of instruction. So after several times, for example, trying to promote peer feedback in your classroom, you may want to reflect and think about how often your learners provide peer feedback. What kinds of tasks and procedure might promote your learners' peer feedback provision than other tasks and procedures? And finally, you may also want to consider your learners' background and cultural norms when it comes to how often and how comfortable they feel about giving peer feedback to one another. So if we bring all of these sources of knowledge together, as the teacher, you may be able to form your working theory of peer feedback, and at the end of the day, some kind of guidelines for yourself on how best to promote your learners' peer feedback in a second language classroom. All right, so that's everything that we'd like to share with you today. Thank you so much for your attention, and especially for your participation in those activities that we've set out for you today. And we'd like to also ask if you have any questions or any other, yeah.
Thanks, Mai. Thanks, Phung. That's fascinating. I've got so many questions, but I can see there's quite a few questions in the chat that I'd like to address, and one or two people I'm going to invite to ask their own questions as well. Before I ask Ming-Tu Chan to speak, because I see you've had like 2 or 3 comments or questions, which are really, really great questions, actually. But somebody, Chang, had a question, which I think maybe you can answer, hopefully quite quickly. Is this feasible in a large class size? She asked.
Can I chime in? Yes, I can answer. It's feasible, but it's difficult. And one of the way that we could do, based on also from the research that we read and we've done so far, if the class is big, it's not possible to give the training to the learners individually. So one of the suggestions that we got, we have for you is to do the pre-recorded modeling video. So you recorded the modeling first in the video and you give it to the students so that they can watch it at home, and that's how they can practice at home. When it comes to the classroom, you don't need to pay attention to the particular pairs of groups in order to train them. You got the modeling video, they can watch it over and over again. And then it means that you are kind of like done the first part of the modeling. When it comes to the second stage where you do the use in the context, the practice, that is where you can do with a big class. So that's one of the ways that you can do.
Thanks, Phung. Thanks for answering Chang's question. And I think also, yeah, and Chang said thanks as well in the chat. So thanks, Chang. And I think I love the fact that both of you, both Phung and Mai, were talking so much. You kept reiterating the point about learner training and the importance of learner training. And I think that's the thing. And that leads very nicely to one of Ming-Tu's questions. So Ming-Tu, if you're there, my colleague Nguyen is going to give you access to the mic. So can you ask your questions? Oh, so
you can unmute.
no, she's her mic is broken, so it's okay, Ming-Tu. I've got the questions here. So there were two questions. The first one, or question or comment, was about students don't trust their peers to give feedback, and they often rely or prefer that the teachers give feedback. What's your response to that, either of you?
I think that concerns is legitimate in the sense that we, as a teacher, sometimes we don't trust that our students are able to provide a feedback. That is just an assumption. And for us, raising learners' awareness is important. When we say raising awareness, we mean that, especially for advanced learner or higher proficiency, I would say a higher proficiency learner, even though the proficiency level is too low, as long as the higher proficiency learner establish a good relationship with the lower proficiency learner, when you pair them, the higher one can have the lower proficiency learner in terms of the language issue, and that is how they provide each other with the feedback. There may be a concern saying that the higher proficiency learners don't want to work with the lower proficiency learners, saying that I'm not learning anything from my peers who is, less advanced than me. It is important for the teacher to raise this particular higher proficiency learners towards the benefits of teaching and helping their peers. When you know about that language issue, you are able to help your friends, you are able to teach. It means that you are mobilizing your knowledge. And also it is important for the teacher to point out that the act of teaching is also the act of learning. By helping and teaching their peers, they are learning. And also another thing that we point out is that people like to be helpful and like to help each other. If you say that you are helping your friends because you are good, you are advanced, I think with that strategies, higher proficiency learners are more likely to help their peers. And it comes back to how the teacher create the atmosphere where they feel safe, comfortable, not ashamed and not losing face when it comes to feedback provision, and those social factors can be addressed. But it takes a bit of time in terms of creating that atmosphere, and I believe as an experienced teachers, you are able to do that. So hopefully that is one way we can go ahead. Yep.
Could I also add that
Sure, Mai.
because we mentioned earlier that it's really important to understand our learners. So, of course, as teachers, we have much intuitive knowledge of what our learners think about each other and what they might like doing. But from my experience, it's really useful to formally survey, to do some kind of just a quick survey with your learners as well, to really understand what they think about receiving and providing feedback to one another, so that as a teacher we have the right kind of awareness raising activity for different groups of learners, depending on how comfortable they are with peer feedback.
Thanks. And we've just only got 5 minutes left, and I've got one more question from Ming Tu, which I'll raise. And then if anybody has any other questions, please, and you have access to a mic, please raise your hand and we can let you ask the question to Mai and Phung, or please write your question in the chat. Yeah. So Ming Tu's second question was about the benefits of immediate correction or immediate feedback versus delayed feedback, and the impact that might have on the accuracy versus fluency discussion. Does it interrupt? If you do it too much immediate feedback, does that interrupt the fluency, even though you're focusing on accuracy? So Mai, Phung, I don't know who wants to take that question first.
That's very interesting questions. And regardless of the fact that we are suggesting, providing feedback, promoting peer feedback, it is important to keep in mind that this kind of feedback should not impede the comprehension and the flow of communication. So the communication in the activity is a key that needs to be maintained, but the feedback provision is just some instances where learners draw their attention to the language issues that impede their comprehension during the interaction. So we encourage to provide learners to focus on language issues that interfere with the interaction, rather than simply pointing out all of the errors during the interaction. It's not possible, and it will divert learners' attention to the language rather than a communication. We need to keep in mind that the key is still the interaction. Also, one more thing, from research, we suggest that when it comes to errors, what errors should I pay attention to? What errors should I provide a feedback, and how can I not paying too much attention to the language and then forget about the flow of communication? We suggest focus on consistent errors. It means errors that occurs consistently. So those errors should be paid attention. The errors that are minor and the errors that do not interfere the comprehension or understanding, those errors can be neglected or can be ignored a bit. But as a teacher, we need to knock down those. And then at the end of the class, we got something we say review section, where you list all of the errors that you notice the learners having when you are observing the activities. Then you present to the whole class. This is something that you pay attention to. But when it comes to the moment of interaction, just focused on consistent errors that are consistently made, and those are the keys. So that is our suggestion for that issue.
Thanks. Mai, anything you'd add?
Just one thing about the right moment of giving feedback, and I just wanted to reiterate what Phung said about immediate feedback is probably desired when learners have problems understanding one another and moving on with the interaction. And for other kinds of errors in terms of accuracy, but still doesn't impede, doesn't affect meaning, may perhaps be delayed at a later stage in the interaction.
Great, thanks. And yeah, and I hopefully that's answered both of Ming Tu's questions. And I think Ming Tu said thanks, and she also says that she wants to encourage going back to the first question, encourage less capable students, as Phung was just saying before, to give feedback instead of always receiving feedback. So again, I think that goes back to that idea, as you both mentioned, again, about learner training and the importance of bringing in that learner training of what are the benefits of peer feedback and how different people can benefit. And again, your evidence of, like, you know, the 88% accurate is an amazing figure. that's a great kind of evidence of, you know, why we should encourage perhaps peer feedback amongst our learners. I think we've covered all the questions. I don't think I've missed anybody's questions there at all. Yeah, Gwyn said a very good point. Looking forward to how to train learners. Maybe that can be our next webinar. It's a great suggestion, Gwyn. Thank you. That could be a whole other webinar about learner training. Brilliant. I'm getting lots of likes as well in the chat there. Anyway, it's 5:30, everybody, and I said we'd try to finish by 5:30 today. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Mai and Phung for giving up their Saturday morning in Manchester to share their research and share some of their ideas and activities and techniques. And again, it's great to see all the thanks and the appreciation in the chat as well. I've also shared in the chat the links to the research, which is on the Teaching English website. As I said, that this webinar will be put on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days, hopefully early next week. And also, I've just put in the chat as well our Facebook page, so you can click on our Facebook page at any time if you're not already members and find out more about other activities that are coming up. And I just want to very quickly share with you, I said, and I'll put the link as well so you can register in the chat in just a moment. But I just want to share with you another webinar. Oh, hopefully you can see that. Yes, I think you can see that now. I mentioned before, on Wednesday, our English language teaching, our British Council, colleagues in Indonesia are having a webinar on gamification in English language teaching. This will be part of this will be a 5-part series, I think, on these Wednesdays through June and through July. So I will put the link to that in the chat right now. And that's not it. Bear with me a second. Jumping between screens here. There it is. Okay, so you can have a look at the information, and you can also register for that as well. If you're interested in gamification, there you go. Hopefully that link will work and you can get that. So yeah, as Lana said in the chat, thanks so much, Mai and Phung, for an really informative presentation. I say I've got so many more questions I have, but I hope we can come back another time and discuss some of those. So on behalf of everybody, thanks everybody for giving up your Saturday afternoon in Vietnam. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and to Mai and Phung again, a huge thanks for giving up your time. All right, and hope to see you all very soon in our next webinar. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon. Bye for now.